Good morning. So we are going to talk about the 1840s right now and the Mexican-American War. We had left off in the political sphere anyway with Jackson not running for re-election, Martin Van Buren beating three Whig candidates, but almost immediately have a depression, and Van Buren is struck with this terrible economic downturn. And so most of his four-year term will be fighting that. So in 1840, he's up for re-election. The Democrats are not real keen on re-electing him, but they don't have much of a choice. The new Whig Party nominates William Henry Harrison, World War of 1812 hero, and his nickname is Old Tippecanoe. And they also nominate John Tyler, Southerner, and so they have a nice catchy slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And they refer to Van Buren as Martin Van Ruin, and so it doesn't turn out too well. So to sum it up, Harrison wins and gives a 2-hour speech in the rain at his inauguration and dies 30 days later, and Tyler becomes president. He's going to be the first person to take over for a dead president, and he's not really a Whig. In fact, he ends up vetoing most of the Whig proposals. They really didn't expect Harrison to die, and so Tyler ends up being a person without a party, which brings us to travel a little bit back in time. What's going on in Texas? Well, Texas declared independence March 2nd, 1836 from Mexico. I'm not going to go into a lot of reasons for that. You get that in Texas government, but there are really three major battles. There's the Alamo, the Goliad, and San Jacinto. At the Alamo, it's 188 Texans versus 4,000 Mexican troops under Santa Anna. The Texans are wiped out, but the Mexicans lose 1,500. Then at the Goliad, the Texans surrendered and they are executed. The final part of that battle is the Battle of San Jacinto, where Sam Houston and his army surprise Santa Anna's army. The Texans lose 9, but the Mexicans lose 630, and the war is over. Santa Anna is captured. He is forced to sign a treaty recognizing Texas independence, and then he is released. Of course, once he's released, he's saying that, well, I renounce that treaty because it's not a fair treaty. And then the question was, what were the boundaries really of this new Texas state? Was it going to be, as Texans wanted, the Rio Grande up to its source, or was it, as Mexico would argue, it would be at the Nueces River? Well, the first thing that the Texans do is that they vote for annexation into the United States. They want to be part of the United States. But the United States isn't sure if they really want Texas, because it's a slave state, and there were those who didn't want to have that. And they also felt like that it would mean war with Mexico, and they were sure they didn't want to do that either. And so for about 9 years, Texas is its independent country, and it's really a flop. They don't have no party structure. They're in debt. They even flirt with the idea of becoming part of the British Commonwealth, maybe to try to make the Americans annex them. It had been hard to be part of the British Commonwealth because they had already abolished slavery. So the issue's out there. In the election of 1844, the Democrats abandoned Van Buren because Van Buren opposed annexing Texas. And so they chose James K. Polk. They liked Polk because he favored taking Texas, California, and Oregon. And the Whigs nominated Henry Clay. Again, Clay had run in 1824. He had run in 1832. And now here he is running again in 1844. And he doesn't win. So James K. Polk is the new president. And Polk is 49 years old. He's the younger Congress for 14 years. He was the Speaker of the House for 4 years. His nickname was Young Hickory, as opposed to Jackson being Old Hickory. He works 18 hours a day, which will eventually destroy his health. He's pro-slavery, which will alienate some of the northern Democrats. Now, Polk's objective is going to be to reduce the tariff, settle the Oregon question. If you remember, Oregon was in dispute between Britain and the United States. They had settled on joint occupation, but now America wants them gone. And to acquire California was the other thing that he wanted to do. What about Texas? Well, the annexation of Texas was already underway because Tyler signed the annexation before leaving office because he saw that with Polk winning that Americans wanted Texas. So they did, and Texas becomes a state on December 29th in 1845. Now, with Oregon, Polk wants all of Oregon. And when we think of Oregon today, it's different. Back then, when we say Oregon, we're talking about Oregon, Washington, and what would be British Vancouver today. Britain doesn't want to give it up. Polk ready to go to war over this issue. The British don't want war. So they both sides agreed to what they call the 49th parallel. That's the line that goes across today. And so he gets Oregon and Washington, but not Vancouver or British Columbia. So, Mexican-American War. Polk wants California. He tries to buy it from Mexico, and Mexico will not sell. So Polk will fight to get what he wants. He sends General Zachary Taylor, down to the Rio Grande. This is an area that's in dispute. Mexico doesn't recognize that as Texas. The United States says it is. The idea is to have the soldiers down there to maybe provoke a war. And then on May 9th, Mexican soldiers kill 11 Americans. Now Polk can blame Mexico for starting the war. He says that American blood has been spilt on American soil, and war is declared on May 13th, 1846. Now, a lot of people oppose this war, mainly from the New England states. John Quincy Adams votes against the war, calls it unrighteous. And then there was one representative who introduced what they call spot resolutions. He said, I want Polk to show me on the spot on American soil where American blood was spilled. In other words, with these spot resolutions, they're essentially calling the president a liar. The person who did this was Abraham Lincoln, and he got the nickname at the time of Spotty Lincoln. Others like Henry David Thoreau opposed the war on the grounds that it would spread slavery. Well, the United States is not ready for war. The army is small. It's about 7,000 troops, and they're inexperienced. The Mexican army has 32,000 troops, but they were forced into the army or taken from prison, so they're not as motivated. By the end of the war, the United States Army will be about 104,000. Many are volunteers. Daniel Webster's and Henry Clay's sons volunteer. But when everybody's volunteering, there's no standard uniform, no standard equipment, no discipline. And a lot of these volunteers will run out of control, raping, stealing, and murdering. One Englishman who was covering the war described them as wild-looking, hairy-faced savages. Yet, they still consistently defeated larger Mexican forces. The Mexican army had problems with training and weapons. Their cannons were so obsolete that the American soldiers could just dodge the cannonballs that rolled past them. Well, the U.S. has no plan of action for the war. Polk wants a war that's big enough to get a treaty to get what he wants, but he doesn't want it too big because out of big wars come heroes, and heroes run for president. At first, he thinks about choosing Winfield Scott to lead the army, but he's a Whig, and they argue all the time. So he goes, okay, I can't have that. And he's a member of the opposite party. So next he chooses Zachary Taylor. Taylor is known as Old Rough and Ready. He wears a straw hat, dusty gray trousers that he mends himself, and a dirty brown overcoat. He's outspoken. He's crusty. He becomes sort of a folk hero. And he'd already won 2 minor battles. Now, as for California, Polk had long wanted California, and so he's going to try to get it before war is declared. He sought to start a Texas-style revolt. In June of 1846, John Fremont and Kit Carson, along with 60 other frontiersmen, declared California a republic. That republic lasts for about 30 days when the Commodore of the Pacific Fleet arrives and states California is now a U.S. territory. So before even Taylor gets into major battles in Mexico, California and New Mexico have been taken. Taylor has to move very slowly because he has to wait for supplies and men. It's always logistics. His first goal is Monterey, which he takes in September of 1846. But for Polk, this is too slow. He's unhappy with Taylor. He thinks he's moving too slowly. The problem with Polk is that he'd never seen the Mexican desert, or that Taylor and his men could live off the land. Therefore, he didn't think they would need a lot of supplies. Polk is also duped by Santa Anna. Santa Anna had been deposed in 1844. He'd fled to Cuba. Santa Anna told Polk that if he'd tell him to get back into Mexico, he would sell what Polk wanted to end the war. So Polk says, okay, I'll help you get back into Mexico. So he gets Santa Anna back into Mexico. Next you know, Santa Anna says, okay, and now it's time to go fight the Americans. And so he prepares the Mexican army to fight the U.S. Polk had actually allowed Mexico's best general to return to power. So Polk decided to move into Mexico by way of Veracruz, which is where everybody seems to invade. He told Zachary Taylor, you just stay where you are, and we'll handle it from here. And Polk chooses Winfield Scott to lead the attack on Mexico City and this invasion through Veracruz. So Taylor says, man, I came all the way out here. I'm going to have another fight, and I'm just going to disobey my orders, and I'm going to make another attack. And so that leads us to the Battle of Buena Vista. It's Taylor's untested volunteers versus Santa Anna's large and untrained army. Santa Anna asked the Americans if they wanted to surrender, and Taylor's reply was, tell them to go to HELL. The Americans won the battle with Taylor's son-in-law, Colonel Jefferson Davis, as the hero. And after the battle, Taylor goes home. It's interesting at this battle that the Illinois militia actually almost captured Santa Anna. They captured his carriage, and they captured his artificial leg. He had a fake leg that was blown off by a cannonball. And if you want to see the fake leg, it's in Springfield, Illinois, in the National Guard Armory. They have it on display. So let's wrap the war up. The Battle of Veracruz, March 9th, 1847. Scott leads his army to the Battle of beaches of Veracruz. They begin their march on Mexico City, September 13th, 1847. A month later, Santa Anna fled the country, and the United States occupies Mexico City. So they end the war with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico gave up all claims to Texas above the Rio Grande, ceded California and New Mexico to the U.S. in return for $18 million. Polk was tempted to take all of Mexico. Just said, we'll just annex it all. But he was afraid that he might lose what he had. So let's talk about the war's legacy. The United States lost about 13,000 men, but only 1,700 in battle. The others died of disease. The cost of the war was $98 million, but the United States got 1 million square miles and great harbors in California and untold mineral wealth. It was several firsts in the war. It was the first war covered by reporters. It's America's first successful offensive war. It was the first American amphibious assault. And it was the first combat experience for U.S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, George Meade, George McClellan, all these Civil War people that we'll be talking about later. Interesting enough, Grant and others later said that the war was a very unjust war, and it was a shameful experience. And so, although at first people were happy with the victory, they felt like, well, we really sort of stole that. Now, they didn't feel so bad to give it back, but there was some reflection. And so that's the Mexican-American War and the 1840s in a nutshell. Our next lecture will be over the Old South and slavery and its anti-slavery movements and slave revolts.